Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, the 14th, where we are moving forward into the 1990s. So, last class, we talked a little bit about Halloween, which came out in 1978, but I think it's a great example of what the 1980s was about in terms of horror film. It was definitely the decade of the slasher film, and reading Halloween as a symbol, as a metaphor of some of the anxieties of the time period, some of the political anxieties and some of the social anxieties of the time period, which is what we've been doing all semester long, basically. And that leads to the final project. As you know, there are four components to this class. The first, the discussion forum questions, and I just pose a question that doesn't have a right or a wrong answer, just so that you can exercise your reasoning skills, and then you can ultimately read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. Though certainly you're encouraged to respond to your classmates if you'd like. The second part of the class are the journals. This is where you're writing about a page response or so to each of the films that we're seeing. And of course, the journals should be unique from the discussion forum responses. And the journals are read just by me, it's not something that's read by your classmates. Then we have ultimately the final project, which I'm hopeful that you are working on at this point in the semester. Thank you to all of you who've reached out thus far about the final project and some of the ideas that you have. What I've suggested is that you write a traditional academic paper, probably in response to one of the films that we viewed this semester, talking a little bit about how it represents the social and cultural anxieties of the time, or perhaps talking a little bit about the symbolism and the literary elements within it, or perhaps talking a little bit about its popularity and how it relates to popular culture. But I've also suggested some more creative responses for those of you who have a more creative bent, that you just make sure that you approve your idea by me ahead of time. And some of you have elected to examine films that we haven't necessarily examined over the semester. Now, that is a possibility, but you do want to talk to me if that's something that you're going to be doing, because I need to have some familiarity with that film to understand whether or not it would be suitable for this kind of analysis. And that said, the Blair Witch Project, I think, is a great example of the 1990s. But before I get into the Blair Witch Project, I wanted to direct your attention to the notes below. And in the second section, you'll see that I've included some information about quoting and documentation. Because if you are writing a traditional academic paper, you are probably going to need to be quoting. Now, I've suggested that you write a critical paper, so you don't necessarily have to reference outside sources. So you can put together all of the learning that has occurred over the course of the semester based on the readings we've done in class and based on my class videos, the class discussions. That said, you could use outside resources or research paper. And if you are going to do that, you want to make sure that you're documenting correctly. And it could turn out that what you are going to be doing is a little bit of both, so that I wanted to make sure that I covered, albeit briefly, some of the conventions of quotation and documentation, even though this is something that you should have covered in your English 101 class, which is why English 101 is a prerequisite for this course. The assumption is that you already have some familiarity with putting together an academic analysis. But since this is a communications class, a humanities class, it's covered by the MLA, which I hope is a term that you've heard of before in other classes. MLA stands for Modern Language Association, and they are the professional organization that makes the rules, if you will, for quotating or for quotation and documentation, and also conventions for writing in the humanities. Now, there are different systems for different disciplines, so you want to make sure that you're using the correct system for the correct discipline. So you might be familiar with the APA, which is the American Psychological Association. which is what we use for the sciences. And regardless of the system that you're using, the intent is just pretty much the same across the board, is to provide the reader of your paper enough information so that they could verify the authenticity of your quotations. And you're supposed to document an exact quote or an original idea that can't be attributed to you, that isn't considered to be common knowledge. Now, the way that the MLA works, which is the system that we're using, is um, making sure that at the ending of the quote, we identify the location of that quote through parenthetical documentation, which means that at the ending of the quote, and it doesn't matter if your sentence has ended or not, but whenever you're done with your quote, immediately afterwards, you open a parentheses, and within that parentheses, you put the least amount of information necessary for a reader to be able to understand where that quote occurred. And then you have a closing quote or a closing parentheses, and then you can end your sentence with its punctuation or continue your sentence if need be. And the entire system builds upon itself. So basically, probably the least amount of information you would need to put in those parentheses is something like a page number, if you were working with a book, for instance. Now, of course, if you're using different editions of books, their page numbers are different. So we have a way of listing all of the information about that particular book or whatever resource you used, whether it's a magazine article or it happens to be an internet website, whatever the case may be. So as you can see in the second section below under quoting and documentation for the MLA, that I've given you an example of a quotation. Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote. And then I open parentheses, I put the number 162, close parentheses, put a period. That means that on page 162, you should be able to find that quote. And if it turns out that you're not done with your sentence, as I had indicated, you can just continue on with your quote. So for instance, although, quote, Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, and in parentheses is 162, notice there is no word like page or PG, nothing like that, just the number. Close quotation marks. And then I continue on with my sentence. He cannot pray with his mother. And then there is a closing quote. And you do have some latitude when you're quoting. So the idea behind a quote is that you get to select when to begin and end the quote. It could even be in mid-sentence of the author's statement. But in between the start and the end point, the starting of the quote and the ending of the quote, you do have a little bit of latitude. So for instance, if you could insert your own language in the beginning or in that quote somewhere between the beginning and the ending of it. And you wouldn't do that for commentary. You can always do commentary immediately before or after a quote. You would do that, let's say, for clarification. Let's say an unclear pronoun. So you're using a pronoun, and based on the sentence that you've selected, it's unclear who that pronoun is referencing. So you might be using the pronoun he, and you might need to write something like Dr. Caligari to clarify that you're talking about Caligari and you're not talking about Francis in terms of the he based on the quote that you've used. And the way you do that is by using square brackets, not parentheses, not the curved, but square brackets. And anything within the square brackets is basically alerting the reader that that was not part of the original quote. That's your insertion. And you can also omit part of a quote. And again, you get to decide when to begin it and when to end it. But in between those 2 points, if you decided to leave out a section of a quote because it's not relevant, you wouldn't leave out a section of a quote to change its meaning. That would not be ethical. But what you would do is use something called an ellipsis, and that's fondly known as the 3 periods or the 3 dots. You can see an example below under omission, as well as insertion. For the insertion, it says, quote, even his, and then in square brackets, I've got the name Krebs's, so that was not part of the original quote. Close square brackets. Lies were not sensational. And then end my quote, open my parentheses, put the page number 162, close parentheses, and then the ending punctuation. Ending punctuation comes after parentheses. And for omission, the example I've given is Krebs, comma, quote, during this time, and then I've got those three periods or those three dots, was sleeping late in bed. And now I've got close quote, open my parentheses, the number 162, close parentheses, and then I can either end my sentence or continue on, whatever the case may be. So, how does all of this work? In that there is usually at the ending of the paper something called the works cited page. The works cited page is where you list all of the resources that you've used in detail. So, this is where you list all of the information about the book or the magazine article or the website or whatever it is that you might have used. And you list all of that by author's last name in alphabetical order. And there's a way to cite a book that's slightly different than a magazine article, that's slightly different from a website. And basically, I think of the MLA almost like a cookbook, in that you look up in their reference book of the MLA um, what the system is that you're supposed to be using, and also what the conventions are, and you just follow the recipe, so to speak. So whatever it is you're supposed to be listing for a magazine, you do it exactly the way the MLA tells you to do it, including where the punctuation goes and where the indentations go and so forth. The same with the website, and the same with the magazine article, and so forth and so on. And all of that is there so that a reader could go to your original sources and verify the authenticity of the quote. Now, in terms of the works cited page, if you are not going to be quoting outside resources, you may not necessarily need to submit a works cited page. It depends on the professor. Especially if you're following the conventions of writing, where in your introductory paragraph you list the name of the author and the text that you are going to be discussing, as well as your thesis. So if that happens to be the only thing that you're discussing, then you wouldn't necessarily have to add a works cited page. Again, it depends on the teacher. I don't require it because everybody would be writing basically the same information, the class textbook. And the idea is that you've already learned how to do this in English 101, so you don't necessarily have to duplicate it. That said, for any students who do want to include a works cited page, you want to make sure you're doing it correctly. And if you are using outside resources, then you have to include the works cited page. And I've given you two websites that are wonderful websites in terms of developing your writing. And you might have heard of both of them in other English classes. One is called Purdue OWL, and it was done by Purdue University. Basically, they've made it available to the public. You don't have to be a student at Purdue. It talks about the entire writing process, the very beginning from generating ideas to the very ending, what your final manuscript should look like, and everything in between. And there's a lengthy section there about how to document. And another site that I recommend is our very own GCC library. Our library is quite aware that you will be writing papers in classes, and if that happens to be the case, you might want to utilize the library guides. The librarians have put together general elements of what is expected in academic writing, including how to go about quoting and citing. So I have both of those websites there. And in terms of thinking about film, if you're just discussing film, then you would not, in the parentheses, talk about a page number. In that instance, you would talk about the timestamp for when that particular quotation occurs. And remember that I've included all of the links for all of the films that we've seen this semester, and I've suggested multiple viewings of each of the films so that you become quite familiar with them. However, the films are also available on reserve in the GCC library. So if you are quoting from the film, you might need to rewatch the film so that you can find the timestamp of the moment in which that particular quotation is said. So the only other thing that I really wanted to state about quotation was about block quotation. If you have a long quote, generally speaking, that means approximately over 3 lines. Not 3 sentences, 3 lines. And what you would do is you block off that quote so that it looks like a block of text, in effect, within your own text. So it's very easy to see the beginning and the ending of that quote. So you've probably seen this in books where something has been blocked off, a long quotation. And the reason why you do that is, again, to make it easy for the reader to know where the quotation ends. We usually assume if we see quotation marks, then an ending will be coming shortly. But if your quotation is over 3 lines, then block it in. Usually, most people do that by indenting the quote so that it's centered on the page, though it could be justified on the right side, it could be justified on the left side. But basically, more often than not, you see it centered. Doesn't much make a difference, but it is very clear to the reader where the beginning and the ending of that quote is. And because you are indenting and formatting in such a way so that it's very clear that this is a quotation, you do not need to use quotation marks. So that would be considered redundant. The only reason why we use quotation marks is to indicate that, well, we are quoting. And just one minor difference is that when you are block quoting, you have your end punctuation first and then your parenthetical documentation. It's the exact opposite when you are quoting within your paper. You have your parenthetical documentation first, then your end punctuation. I honestly don't know why. I kind of liken it to driving, how different states might have different rules about turning on red, for instance. And in the end, you just have to follow the laws or the conventions of the time. So, again, you can look up all of this, and certainly if you've got questions, you can ask me as well. But I'm hopeful that at this point you're putting some serious thought into the final project. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a paper. I've talked about how people have submitted in things like screenplays and models, and you've got options. But if you are going to do something more creative, you definitely want to talk with me. And you probably want to submit something that talks a little bit about your reasoning and the choices that you happen to make. And that said, we've got a few films left in the semester. We started in the 1920s, as you know, with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and we've worked our way to the 1990s. So if you haven't found a film yet for the final project, there's still time. As you know, the final project is not due until the ending of the semester, deliberately so that you would have had an opportunity to view and to think about all of the films. But certainly, once you've decided on a topic, you can begin. And the idea behind the final project is that if you handed it at the ending of the semester, well, then you probably wouldn't have time for a revision. If you handed it in early, then you might have time for a revision. It would just depend on the number of papers that I have to grade as well. So, the Blair Witch Project came out in 1999. It's an hour and 21 minutes, so it's not a terribly long film, but it was a terribly influential film. It helped to really cement the idea of the found footage movement, and it was very meta. We've got a movie about a movie. So now we're at the point where basically horror film can reference itself. It's something we talked about with Night of the Living Dead, where you've got that very famous line from Johnny, "They're coming to get you, Barbara." So, in other words, popular culture has become familiar enough with horror film and the conventions associated with it that it could self reflect. And the method acting that was used for this faux documentary, they filmed it in a documentary style, but it's not a real documentary, helped to give it this sense of reality. A lot of the lines and reactions were ad libbed by the actors themselves. And in many ways, it's similar to slasher films, much like we talked about with Halloween, where you isolate your characters. And we know that isolation is always a bad thing in the world of the Gothic and in the world of horror film, and then you eliminate them by some sort of dehumanizing force. The attempt to give us the sense of a faux documentary utilized shaky camera techniques that not only gave a sense of realism but also gave the audience a sense of physical discomfort, mimicking the physical discomfort that the actual characters are experiencing. Now, warning alert here. If you happen to be somebody who suffers from motion sickness, and I do a little bit, it might be difficult to watch this film because of the shaky camera. I know that I have experienced that. That happens to be the case. What I usually do is I avert my eyes and I look somewhere else, a wall, the floor, whatever the case is, until my stomach is settled down so that I can watch again. This was an independent movie. Note how many of these horror films are independent movies, and because they haven't had to follow the conventions of Hollywood, I think they've oftentimes been able to do more than just follow the Hollywood esque formula for horror film, that they've been able to give us social and political commentary, sometimes being quite subversive, actually, which is what we talked about with Night of the Living Dead and all of the metaphorical and symbolic ways that we could read that particular film. And I had assigned a documentary for you to watch. This was a real documentary, not a faux documentary, about the director, Night of the Living Dead, Birth of the Living Dead, to give you a sense of how revolutionary that film was and how it was put together from the director's standpoint. Um, the shoestring budget that we've talked about with independent films is only more shoestring in this particular film. $60,000, absolutely nothing in 1999, and still nothing today when you think about the cost of filmmaking. Basically, what you had were a group of film students who pulled together their credit cards, took out cash advances, and filmed this piece. I'm not suggesting that you do that, but obviously the risk was quite successful. This film has made over $250 million. So they definitely got back their return and then some. And now we're at the point of talking about films that are more contemporary. The 1990s were a particularly interesting decade for a couple of reasons. The first is that we were entering into the 2000s, something that we'll talk about next class when we talk about 28 Days Later. So, the sense of apocalypse that we talked about in things like Night of the Living Dead is something that you can see in many of the films of the 90s. But more importantly, I think, is that the 1990s was really the birth of the internet and our technological revolution. And I've always seen this film as a commentary, in some ways, very forward understanding of the impact of technology on our society. The marketing was nothing short of genius because what they did was they created an internet website called BlairWitch.com, which no longer is active, unfortunately. It'll just take you to Lionsgate Pictures. But basically, what you got was newsreel footage and interviews of these three rural filmmakers who were shooting a film on an urban legend called the Blair Witch. It seemed very realistic. And they even made a documentary which they aired on the Sci Fi Channel in 1999 entitled The Curse of the Blair Witch. And many people who saw that documentary thought it was a real documentary. So you put all of that together, as well as the Internet Movie Database, which is a very highly respected and esteemed database, actually listed the actors in this movie as deceased, because that's the story in this movie, that these three amateur filmmakers go out to make a film and they disappear and probably are dead. And what's left is the footage that they took, this found footage, which we are viewing. So you put all of that together, and audiences actually thought that the Blair Witch existed and that this was a real story. It was wonderful for ticket sales. And as much as things change, they remain the same. So if you know anything about Orson Welles and his radio program, War of the Worlds, in the early days of media where we didn't have television, this was a radio program that was basically put together as a news broadcast of a very famous science fiction story, War of the Worlds. But because it sounded so realistic on the radio, that audiences actually thought it was true. And they acted with hysteria. And it was about maybe 10 years ago or so where the Discovery Channel had aired a faux documentary that seemed very real about something called the megalodon, which is a prehistoric shark. And for the individuals who missed the opening saying that this was not real, they believed what they were actually seeing, to quite a bit of uproar. And certainly you could think about 2024 and all of the questions we have about how real is the media and how trustworthy is the media and what is fake and what is real. And I think all of those questions that we deal with, um, very commonly in 2024 were questions that in the 1990s these filmmakers understood would become central to us. In fact, one of the questions of what is reality and what is sane and what is not sane, a question that goes all the way back to Dr. Caligari. What can we believe? What is real? There is lots of movie techniques, that try to mimic reality, but basically the characters are unsure of what reality is, because technology can record, but it can also distort, as we know in our own time. This is part of what's known as the technological uncanny. The uncanny, as we talked about with Freud, is that which is familiar yet also alien. And one of my favorite quotes in the film is when the character Josh tells the character Heather, quote, "I see why you like this video camera so much. It's not quite reality. It's totally like a filtered reality, man. It's like you can pretend everything's not quite the way it is." Now, keep in mind that they didn't have cell phones at that time, so they were relying on things like video cameras. But this idea, again, of how trustworthy is technology, and Heather basically films this filtered reality because it's the only thing she has left, as she says. It's the only thing that is giving her any kind of comfort. And we see how this technology can protect her against the horrors of the natural world. And again, I can see lots of modern day parallels here as individuals try escapism through technology and are unsuccessful. This is a very subtle, ambiguous film, very much in the tradition of the English ghost story, which is also very subtle and ambiguous. We fear what we don't see, we fear the unknown, and technology is the unknown. And the internet seemed, I can tell you because I was alive in the 90s, almost magical, supernatural thing at the time period. Just think about the word occult, which means unknown. So you're trying to examine that which is unknown. The theme of civilization versus wilderness, it's a theme we oftentimes see in literature. Definitely, this is a theme that we are going to see in this particular film. In fact, they even make references to the idea that their technology is not going to save them now that they're in the wilderness. In fact, they're ill prepared to leave society. The fact that we've got two males and one female also leads to some interesting gender analysis if you wanted to view the film from that lens. We talked a little bit about this with Halloween, where we had the very iconic Laurie, who's become the final girl, strong female who survives in the end, but she's brutalized and terrorized along the way. So it's a kind of mixed message about female that we get there. And also, as we've seen with so many horror films that have their tradition going all the way back to the Gothic, we see the past colliding with the present. There really is no way to escape from the past. And these ancient myths and ancient fears of the Blair Witch are definitely colliding with the present of technology. And if you wanted to think about gender, witches are oftentimes associated with female as well. If you know anything at all about the Salem witch trials, you know that it was basically a paranoid hysterical movement to try to identify females who didn't fit into the conventions of the time by accusing them of witchcraft. So, just some things to think about when you are watching the Blair Witch Project. And the ending, I think, is particularly significant in the Blair Witch. I know that for me, I find it to be quite unsettling. I'm not going to give away any spoilers. I know other people have been disappointed by it, and so that's something for you to think about. But in terms of our class discussion forum question, what I wanted to ask you, and this will be due Saturday the 16th. Certainly, if you need additional time, let me know. As you can see, I've caught up with the discussion forum questions, and I've caught up with most of the journal submissions that you've given thus far. As you know, I was ill a couple classes back, so I've been playing catch up. So the question is, how do you think the Blair Witch Project represents 1990s anxieties in America? How do you think the Blair Witch Project represents 1990s anxieties in America? And in fact, it's a question we've been asking with all of the films that we've been watching. And we'll also watch next class with 28 Days Later. And luckily, thus far, it seems that I've been able to continue to find links for free online, though certainly if you find better links, please share those with me. Now, 28 Days Later is a longer movie. It's 1 hour and 53 minutes. We'll talk about how this movie is very much, I think, representational of some of the anxieties and fears of the 2000s. But in the fourth section below, I've included a link. So if you wanted to start watching that early, you could. And certainly, I've included the link for the Blair Witch Project, which is the same link that I had included last class. So if you didn't watch, or if you haven't watched the Blair Witch Project yet, then certainly it's time to watch the Blair Witch Project. And after we get to the 2000s, we basically will end the semester in the 2010s with a film that basically served as my inspiration for this course, entitled Get Out by Jordan Peele. And I'm still searching for something for the 2020s, so we are quickly nearing the mid section of the decade. So perhaps that film hasn't been made yet. Perhaps it has. I have no idea. But at this point, I'm going to leave you with watching The Blair Witch Project. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class by putting some closure onto The Blair Witch Project and also talking about 28 Days Later. And obviously, just like the discussion forum question, you have a journal response on The Blair Witch Project, also due on Saturday. But if you need an extension, please let me know. Again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Take care. Bye-bye.